Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into Naomi Klein's really seminal work, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. And this book, it doesn't just list events, it gives you a framework, a lens for understanding how moments of, profound collective shock.
Right, like a national trauma.
Exactly, whether it's a political crisis, a war, an economic crash, or even a natural disaster, it shows how these moments are consistently used, often ruthlessly, to push through radical political and economic changes.
Changes that, under normal circumstances, would probably be rejected.
Absolutely rejected outright by the public.
And that's the core observation, isn't it? It's a really challenging one to face because we naturally focus on the trauma itself, the bomb that falls, the hurricane that hits.
The human cost.
The human cost, exactly. The immediate suffering is immense, and that's where our attention goes. But this deep dive, it kind of shifts the camera. We're looking at how that disaster isn't just a backdrop. It's used as a systemic strategic opportunity.
A repeatable playbook.
Yes, for consolidating power, for making enormous amounts of money, and for ramming through these huge policy shifts. It's all about how that initial shock, the trauma, is used to clear the ground for something entirely new.
And often permanent. New structure of power and wealth.
Right.
So our mission today is to really trace the operational logic of this shock doctrine as Klein lays it out. And that means we have to look at the institutions involved, map out the financial and political incentives that are driving these actors.
The mechanics of it all.
The mechanics, precisely. And to analyze the strategy that's used over and over again across different continents and decades. So this is an examination of systemic outcomes, and we'll be sticking to the logic and evidence presented in Klein's analysis.
Okay, so let's unpack that. It feels like we need some context first about the author and the time this book is looking at, because the timing here seems critical.
It's everything.
Naomi Klein, she's an investigative journalist, and she focuses very intensely on political economy. A lot of you might know her from her earlier book, No Logo.
A huge book on branding and globalization.
Right. And the Shock Doctrine was written as this sweeping response to the really aggressive and in some cases violent expansion of neoliberal economic models that happened right after the Cold War. It tries to explain how these models took over the world so quickly.
And what's so fascinating when you get into the research is the contrast. The gap between the official story of how free markets spread and what the source material actually documents.
What's the official story then?
Well, the official narrative, especially the one that was popular in the West in the 80s and 90s, paints it as a kind of democratic and intellectual victory. The idea that policies from figures like Reagan and Thatcher just won the argument.
The triumph of
The natural triumph of free market thinking, yeah.
But the book argues the historical truth is, well, a lot messier.
Much messier. These campaigns for radical economic change, they almost never happened on some smooth democratic path with popular support. Klein shows again and again that the most extreme versions of these policies almost always followed a moment of intense instability.
A major societal event.
A cataclysmic one, usually. If you look at the timeline, the application of these shock policies across Latin America and Africa in the 80s, it often followed huge debt crises. These crises left national governments just completely desperate.
Stripped of any power to negotiate.
Exactly. Their financial systems had collapsed. They had nowhere to turn except to international lenders like the IMF and the World Bank.
And you see a similar pattern in Asia in the late 90s, right? It wasn't some slow democratic debate that opened up those economies.
Not at all. It was the devastating financial crash of 97-98 that brought the so-called Asian tigers to their knees. And overnight, their economies were forced open to what the financial press at the time was gleefully calling the world's biggest going-out-of-business sale.
That's a brutal phrase.
It is. But it captures the mood. These weren't moments of clear-headed choice. They were moments of profound societal breakdown that created the political opening.
And this brings us to a really critical point the book makes about the difference between sort of partial reforms and the full radical vision.
Yes, this distinction is key. Klein argues that, sure, you could get some free market policies passed in a democracy. Look at the U.S. under Reagan. He had radical plans, but they still had to be, watered down and debated because of public pressure and Congress.
But to get the full package.
The full, uncompromising, unvarnished vision that often required authoritarian conditions, or at least a temporary but effective suspension of democracy.
So are you saying the book argues that this economic shock therapy was applied without any restraint in places like, say, Pinochet's Chile in the 70s, or post-Tiananmen China, or post-Soviet Russia, only because some major collective trauma had basically shut down the democratic process?
That is the core of the argument, yes. Without the political paralysis created by that shock, these policies, we're talking massive privatization of public services, getting rid of subsidies, extreme deregulation, they would have been politically impossible.
Because they're just fundamentally unpopular.
Deeply unpopular with most people. When you're just focused on survival, you can't really organize an effective resistance.
Okay, so let's nail down this central thesis. We want to state the core concept as clearly as we can for you. So, economic shock policies, radical privatization, mass deregulation, deep cuts to social spending are deliberately pushed through during moments of collective shock and disorientation.
And that strategy, it allows for the swift imposition of policies that would otherwise be, politically impossible under normal, stable conditions.
And this isn't just an observation Klein made after the fact. It's rooted in the thinking of the movement's intellectual godfather.
Milton Friedman, the grand guru of the push for unfettered capitalism. Klein points to what she calls his core tactical nostrum. He observed, and this is a direct quote, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around."
The ideas that are lying around. That phrase is so telling. It suggests this wasn't passive.
Yeah.
It implies a huge amount of deliberate preparation.
Exactly. It implies the Friedmanites, or the Chicago Boys as they came to be known, weren't just waiting for disaster. They were actively preparing for it, stockpiling these meticulously planned free market policy blueprints, making sure they were ready and lying around for when a system failed.
And once that crisis hits,
Speed is everything. Friedman was absolutely convinced of this. The book stresses how crucial it was to act swiftly within a really tight window, maybe 6 to 9 months.
before society slipped back into the tyranny of the status quo.
That's the phrase. The goal is rapid, total, and irreversible change. Get it done before the population can recover from the shock enough to organize and fight back. It's almost a political version of Machiavelli's advice, inflict all your injuries at once so the victim has no time to prepare a defense.
So let's get into the core ideas of the book now. And the argument starts with this incredibly powerful and frankly pretty disturbing metaphor.
It is the psychological parallel between literal torture and economic policy.
And it starts with the literal shock, the source of the book's title. Klein details the work of a Dr. Ewan Cameron at McGill University in the 50s and 60s, experiments funded by the CIA under the M-Culture program.
Right, and Cameron's work was driven by this almost maniacal, pseudo-scientific quest to erase and remake the human mind. His goal was to create a total blank slate in his patients.
How did he try to do that?
By using massive, sustained doses of electroshock therapy. We're talking up to 200 volts, sometimes 63 times on a single patient. That, combined with sensory deprivation, forced comas, experimental hallucinogens, he called the process de-patterning.
I just have to pause on that. That is a truly grim parallel. The scale of the psychological violation there is just staggering. One of his victims, Gail Kastner, remembers the chronic pain, the profound memory loss. She would mix up dates by decades.
And Cameron saw that destruction of memory, that destruction of the personal story, not as a failure, but as the whole point. He wanted to blast patients back into an infantile compliant state so he could, in his view, write new, better psychological patterns onto that cleared slate.
He genuinely saw destruction as a necessary step for creation.
Yes, and that psychological model, destruction before creation, is the absolute foundation of the book's central metaphor. The economic shock doctrine, as Klein defines it, it mimics this process, but on a mass scale.
So the crisis, the war, the coup, the hurricane, that's the massive societal electroshock.
It is. It's designed to put the entire population into a state of deep collective disorientation. This collective shock softens up whole societies, much like a torture cell softens up a prisoner, making them compliant to radical changes they'd normally fight to protect.
So when a society is completely consumed by the immediate trauma, the terror of bombs falling, the need for shelter after a storm, just standing in line for bread, they are psychologically unable to protect their public housing or their schools or their state-owned company.
Exactly, or their pension funds. The citizens are forced to give up political and economic resources that they would normally guard with, extreme vigilance.
The collective shock, leads to a state where, like a terrorized prisoner giving up names and information, shock societies give up sovereignty and public assets.
That's the parallel. And the process that gets deceptively called reconstruction or reform often begins not with fixing what was broken, but with finishing the job of the original disaster, erasing the public sphere and quickly replacing it with a corporate, for-profit structure.
And that brings us back to the ideological architects, Milton Friedman and the Chicago School. Friedman spent decades just patiently protecting and honing this idea of laissez-faire capitalism after the Great Depression.
A time when most of the world had turned its back on those ideas and embraced the Keynesian welfare state. He was convinced history had, quote, got off on the wrong track when government started intervening in the market.
And what was the core belief of the Chicago School?
Friedman and his colleagues, they believed that core economic forces, supply, demand, inflation, were like fixed, self-regulating systems, like the tides or gravity. And any deviation from that equilibrium was entirely the fault of, misguided government interference.
So their work provided a kind of scientific cover for what were essentially corporate demands.
An aura of scientific impartiality, yes, and complex math. All for what corporations wanted anyway. Mass deregulation, radical privatization, and cutting social programs like healthcare, pensions, even national parks. That academic, supposedly neutral veneer was absolutely crucial because they didn't have popular democratic support.
And for its proponents, the beauty of this system, as the book lays out, was that it identified a brand new frontier for profit.
A huge one. Classical colonialism was about conquering new territory for natural resources. Friedman's counter-revolution promised something much bigger, conquering the state itself. You could auction off everything. Public services, assets, communication systems, utility companies, all for super profits.
And this desire for a political blank slate is clearest right after a disaster hits.
Oh, absolutely. Klein quotes Friedman himself. He's 93 years old, writing after Hurricane Katrina, and he sees the immense tragedy of the ruined schools in New Orleans not as a moment for state aid, but as an opportunity to radically reform the educational system.
Which, in practice, meant replacing the public school system with privately run charter schools.
Exactly. The book argues that disaster capitalists have no real interest in repairing what was there before. They want to replace the public sphere entirely with a for-profit structure.
And post-9/11 in the United States is another immediate, powerful example of this strategy.
A perfect one. The trauma of 9/11 created a kind of political year zero. Suddenly, everything that was known and accepted before that day could be dismissed as pre-9/11 thinking.
And that allowed the Bush administration to push through really radical and highly profitable changes very quickly.
Like the move towards privatized wars and the creation of this massive outsourced security complex. And this is where disaster capitalism emerges as a formalized profit model.
Klein emphasizes that the chaos and fear aren't seen as problems.
No, they're explicitly framed as catalysts for each new leap forward. There's a quote from Mike Battles, whose security firm Custer Battles made a fortune in post-invasion Iraq. He said, "For us, the fear and disorder offered real promise."
The profit is in the disorder itself.
It is. First from the disorder and then from the rush to replace the lost public capacity with private solutions. And this new model, it required the massive outsourcing of core state functions.
Things governments always used to do.
Things like interrogation, logistics, military support. And the Bush administration pursued this aggressively with almost no public debate. After 9/11, the New Deal wasn't a public works program. It was a deal made exclusively with corporate America.
Transferring hundreds of billions of dollars
into private hands through lucrative and very often no-bid contracts.
And the scale of this transformation, the statistics are just staggering.
They really are. Take the Department of Homeland Security. Between when it started in 2003 and August 2006, it issued over 115,000 contracts for outsourced security, tech, logistics. The government's role just fundamentally shifted.
From a provider of services
to a deep-pocketed venture capitalist. That's the phrase Klein uses. Seeding and sustaining this new, fully articulated disaster capitalism complex. And this complex, it includes everything from military contractors to intelligence outsourcing to firms that sell temporary bridges and high-tech fences all over the world. It is a system designed to monetize instability.
So the outcome of all this privatization, Klein argues, isn't really about freeing the market from the state. It's that the political and corporate elites just merge.
Yes, They trade favors and influence to secure the legal right to take over resources that were previously in the public domain. And that's something much bigger than just simple corruption.
It's a different kind of system.
It is. A more accurate term for a system that actively erases the boundaries between big government and big business is corporatist. And its main features are these huge, rapid transfers of public wealth into private hands, which fuels exploding public debt and creates this massive chasm between the super-rich elite and an economically disposable poor.
And that elite wealth bubble is then protected.
Huh.
How?
By aggressive nationalism, which is used to justify bottomless security spending, and by comprehensive surveillance, mass incarceration, shrinking civil liberties, and, in the most extreme cases, as the book details, by literal torture.
Okay, so let's dig deeper into the actual mechanism that keeps this corporatist model going. When we talk about systems mapping, we're talking about the actors, governments, corporations, financial institutions, and the narratives they use.
Right. Narratives of crisis, of inevitability, of emergency necessity.
And the incentives for this system are pretty clear. Immediate profit, maximum speed, and power.
Critically, minimum democratic oversight. It's a system built specifically to leverage distress. And, it's deeply ironic that Milton Friedman was so philosophically opposed to institutions like the IMF and the World Bank.
Why is that ironic?
Because his intellectual disciples, the Chicago Boys, they systematically infiltrated and staffed those very institutions. Graduates from the University of Chicago took top positions and started treating national crises not as problems to be solved with aid, but as precious opportunities to leverage their radical economic agenda.
So the IMF and the World Bank became the key delivery mechanism for bundling the shock in the 80s and 90s.
They were absolutely crucial. The structural adjustment, the immediate financial bailout a country needed to stay afloat, was cleverly marketed as the only way to save their economy from total collapse.
And the genius of the marketing was that it hid the fact that the core of the shock, the mandatory privatization and free trade rules, were not actually necessary for fiscal stability.
Exactly. The book cites Donnie Roderick, a respected Harvard economist, who pointed out this was an ingenious marketing strategy because the economists themselves knew that free trade has no direct essential link to creating short-term stability.
So if the privatization wasn't technically necessary for the bailout, how did the IMF legally force a sovereign government to sell off its assets?
The leverage was just pure desperation for cash.
Yeah.
By packaging the emergency aid, which they couldn't refuse, with the ideological demands, the privatization, the deregulation into a single take-it-or-leave-it package.
So the message was basically, want to save your country, sell it off.
That was it. And countries in the middle of a severe crisis, with their currency collapsing, they had almost no choice. They had to accept the entire package, even the parts their own parliaments or citizens were fundamentally against. The speed of the crisis just made democratic resistance impossible.
We have to shift now to the darkest examples of how this restructuring was enforced. The book documents this pretty extensively.
It does. The neoliberal revolution, especially in Latin America, required suppressing the working class and the political left. And the problem wasn't seen as just one politician, like Salvador Allende in Chile.
It was seen as something deeper.
Much deeper, the desire for social democracy itself. An Argentine military veteran is quoted in the book saying, "By 1976, we already knew that the problem was the working class, not just a particular party."
And when you identify the entire working class as the obstacle,
then the full force of state terror is what you use. The violence was specifically required to enforce these deeply unpopular Chicago school policies, like privatizing pensions, eliminating public health care, cutting subsidies. In Chile and Argentina, the military juntas used massacres, state-sponsored disappearances, and systematic torture as a tool of economic policy enforcement.
this is where that psychological parallel we talked about earlier becomes horrifyingly real.
It comes full circle. Torturers in these regimes would literally adopt the posture of a doctor or surgeon. They saw the picana, the electric cattle prod, as a kind of therapeutic medicine.
To cleanse minds of the sickness that was socialism.
And the idea of working-class solidarity. It was a systematic effort to force betrayal, to break the principle of collective action, to create that same blank slate Dr. Cameron was after.
And the terror tactics themselves, they were strategic, designed to be low profile.
Very strategic. The disappearances, for example, throwing victims from planes into the river, was a strategy to spread this crippling fear throughout society while being less visible to the international press than an open massacre would be.
And that compartmentalization was crucial.
It allowed economic spokesmen in the U.S. to simultaneously praise these regimes for their newfound economic freedom, while also talking about human rights, completely separating the violence from the specific economic policies it was enforcing.
So just to be crystal clear, the violence wasn't just political payback. It was necessary to crush opposition to these specific economic laws.
Absolutely. The violence was the enforcement mechanism for policies that could never survive a democratic vote or organized labor resistance. The moment the violence let up, the resistance would come right back. That's why the terror had to be so pervasive. The two things, the economic shock and the systematic repression, the book documents them as inseparable.
Let's trace that full systemic feedback loop then, because this shows how the cycle just keeps reproducing itself. So it starts with a major crisis, hyperinflation, war, natural disaster.
That crisis then leads directly to the imposition of shock policies. Rapid deregulation, privatization, usually done through some kind of emergency powers, to seize that moment of disorientation.
Which then, because you're dismantling public systems and protections, causes massive blowback.
Right. Immediate loss of wages, mass layoffs. Think of the example of Cavallo in Argentina firing 700,000 state workers. That leads to increased poverty, social chaos, unrest.
Which then requires more repression and shock.
You need more surveillance, more paramilitary control, more torture, more censorship to manage the civil disorder that your economic policies created in the first place.
So the system creates the very instability it needs security forces to manage.
Precisely. And that continuous instability, that repression, creates new market opportunities, a constant demand for security, for surveillance, for private infrastructure. From this rising disaster capitalism complex, it's a self-perpetuating negative feedback loop. The system profits from the chaos it generates.
And we can't forget the legacy of the debt bomb that comes out of this cycle.
A devastating legacy. When the military dictatorships in Latin America finally fell, they left these new, fragile democracies shackled with odious debts, massive, often illegal loans that the dictators had taken out.
But how does that work? If the new democratic government didn't take on the debt, why did they have to pay it back?
That's the insidious part of the mechanism. These debts, they were recognized and backed by the international financial institutions. So new democracies, like Argentina in 1983, were forced to pay off these massive illegitimate debts from day one.
Which puts them straight back into crisis mode.
Instantly. It makes them vulnerable to the IMF's shock therapy demands all over again. They were essentially born in economic chains, trapped by financial commitments made by the very regimes that had overthrown their previous democracies. It's a mechanism that ensures the system stays trapped in this loop of vulnerability.
And as this doctrine matured, especially after 9/11, it went global and became deeply militarized. It just transitioned seamlessly into the security economy.
It did. The war on terror, which has no defined battlefield, no end date, no clear enemy, it's an unbeatable economic proposition. It creates this permanent, bottomless revenue stream for private contractors.
We're talking over $270 billion a year just from the Pentagon.
Plus the massive intelligence and homeland security budgets, which are also heavily outsourced. And this unlimited river of cash, it funded the rise of what Klein calls the private shadow state.
Like corporations such as Blackwater.
Exactly. Blackwater was built almost entirely with public money. At one point, 90% of its revenue came directly from state contracts. And yet they built up this massive, privately owned military infrastructure, training facilities, aircraft, thousands of mercenary soldiers on call.
So infrastructure funded by our taxes, but entirely privately owned and controlled.
Yes, a state within a state that isn't subject to public oversight or the Freedom of Information Act.
That critique is really profound. The public pays for the war machine. But private companies own the assets, the bases, the helicopters. What are the long-term consequences of that?
The main consequence is a dangerous erosion of democratic accountability. When a state function is outsourced, the public loses direct control and knowledge over how services are delivered, how money is spent, how violence is used. The company answers to its shareholders, not to the voters.
And it makes it harder to end the conflicts.
Well, much harder, because war and constant tension become indispensable profit centers for these huge, globally connected corporations.
Which leads directly to this idea of disaster apartheid, where your ability to survive a crisis is explicitly tied to your economic status.
We saw this so clearly after Hurricane Katrina. While the poor and uninsured were waiting for help that was late or never came, stuck in the Superdome.
The wealthy could afford private protection, private hospitals, services that literally monetized escape.
A really powerful example is an airline called HelpJet. It marketed itself as the first hurricane escape plan. It offered luxury jet travel and five-star resort stays for its members during an evacuation.
And you contrast that with thousands of people left on rooftops because the public levy system was chronically underfunded.
And the main public hospital, Charity Hospital, had been closed because of budget cuts long before the storm. It's a stark contrast.
And this idea of contract cities, like Sandy Springs in Georgia, which outsourced its entire government to a private firm, that's another piece of this.
It is. It's a glimpse of that apartheid future, where services are no longer a public right. They're allocated based on what you can afford. This fulfills the prediction that security, infrastructure, even basic city services become a function of where you live and whom you work for, not a function of citizenship.
It's a direct result of hollowing out the public sphere.
Which is what the Shock Doctrine necessitates.
So bringing it back to a democratic context, the disaster complex seems to thrive by exploiting the failure of public services. Post-Katrina New Orleans showed that the old idea that disasters are a kind of timeout for capitalism was gone.
Completely abandoned. The human disaster was made so much worse by the pre-existing relentless attacks on public infrastructure, the underfunded levees, the closed hospital.
And instead of being rebuilt, the public sphere in New Orleans was actively erased after the shock.
Actively erased. Public housing projects were scheduled for demolition. Public schools were converted en masse into charter schools, just as Milton Friedman had called for days after the levees broke.
And the Bush administration even refused to let emergency funds be used to pay public sector salaries,
Forcing the city to fire 3,000 workers, including city planners, at the exact moment they were needed most to lead the reconstruction. The system actively worked against a public recovery.
We see a different but related pattern with the relationship between war, peace, and the security economy, especially in Israel.
Right. The book notes a really significant shift. In the 1990s, the thinking among Israeli economic elites was that peace would bring prosperity, it would open up new markets for their traditional exports.
But then, after the dot-com crash around the year 2000, that changed.
It pivoted strategically to become the go-to country for anti-terrorism technologies. The high-tech security export economy, counterterrorism devices, surveillance systems, perimeter security, it just exploded. And this created a powerful economic sector that became incentivized to favor continuous tension, or at least conflict, over lasting peace.
So this security industry boom literally saved Israel's economy.
It did. Security became far more profitable than traditional trade. Companies like Mangal building the security barrier, NICE Systems selling surveillance tech globally. It made security a permanent source of revenue.
And that fundamentally shifted the incentive structure away from finding a resolution to the conflict.
Conflict itself became a marketable, valuable export.
Okay, let's zoom out now and connect the shock doctrine to the broader themes of our channel, Crisis and Perception, which is all about analyzing systemic forces. This book really challenges the idea that we can look at these events, war, corruption, through the lens of just a few bad individuals.
Absolutely. It forces you to look at systems over individual blame. The financial entanglements of figures like Donald Rumsfeld with Gilead Sciences or Dick Cheney with Halliburton. These weren't just isolated cases of crony capitalism.
Look at the difference.
Cronyism implies illegal side deals. The corporate estate implies the legal redesign of government functions for private profit. The war profiteers were indistinguishable from the government itself. They essentially forced the ethics committees to adapt to their position, not the other way around.
The doctrine also relies heavily on hiding the true economic motives, which brings up big questions about transparency and consent.
It does. Back in the 70s, when state terror was being used in Latin America to enforce these policies, the human rights reports, as vital as they were, often missed a key connection.
What did they miss?
Well, they detailed the horrific repression, the torture, the disappearances, but they often left out any mention of the radical capitalist restructuring that was happening at the same time. They didn't ask the simple, logical question, why was all this repression necessary?
And if they had looked at the attacks on trade unions and land reform,
it would have been clear that the violence was required specifically because the economic project, the privatization, the mass layoffs, was rejected by huge numbers of people. The motive was hidden by the horror of the method.
Finally, let's look at the ultimate failure of this strategy, systemic blowback. Dr. Ewan Cameron, he failed to create the perfect, obedient new patterns he wanted. His patients were left broken, confused, often much worse off.
The destruction didn't lead to creation. It led to lasting damage. And that same logic failed on a global scale. The so-called anti-Marshall Plan in Iraq, the rush to privatize everything under Bremer's laws, it didn't create a vibrant new democracy.
It led to massive institutional failure, rampant corruption.
Exactly. The Custer Battles fraud case is a perfect example. And the Occupation Authority even claimed it wasn't subject to U.S. law, making the whole thing a shell game to funnel money to corporations that were operating outside the rule of law.
And the human blowback was immediate and severe. Torture became a primary weapon of the occupation.
But the Red Cross noted that somewhere between 70 and 90% of the detentions in Iraq were mistakes, just people rounded up randomly. And the systematic abuse, especially at places like Abu Ghraib, directly created insurgents.
The system created its own enemies.
It did. A released prisoner is quoted saying, "Abu Ghraib is a breeding ground for insurgents. All the insults and torture make them ready to do just about anything." The attempt to erase dissent through shock backfired, and it fueled a massive, costly resistance movement that the private security apparatus then profited from managing.
The negative feedback loop just became explosive.
It did.
So this deep dive into the shock doctrine, it reveals a pretty hard and recurring truth. Economic equality isn't an idea that just failed on its own. It's an idea so popular with people that it has to be deliberately shocked out of the way when it can't be beaten in a fair democratic debate.
And that focus on rebuilding after a disaster so often serves as a mask for a massive upward redistribution of wealth and the permanent dismantling of the public sphere.
The book's look at 30 years of history seems to confirm that this crisis opportunism isn't some side feature of modern capitalism.
It's foundational to how it achieves its most radical and unpopular goals. And that's why the rise of the corporate estate always seems to go hand in hand with a rolling back of civil liberties and the weaponization of fear.
But Klein doesn't end on a note of just complete despair, does she? She contrasts the disaster capitalism model, which failed so catastrophically in Iraq and New Orleans,
with an emerging resistance model that has developed in Latin America. After experiencing these shocks over and over, grassroots movements there have started building decentralized shock absorbers against this kind of global volatility.
What do those look like?
Things like worker-run cooperatives in Venezuela or the recovered factories in Argentina. They're focused on self-sufficiency, on mutual aid, and on regional economic integration, like ALBA. They're creating local economies that are intentionally less vulnerable to capital flight and external financial pressure.
The fact that institutions like the IMF are losing their grip in Latin America seems like a huge historical shift.
It's crucial. Countries like Venezuela and Argentina withdrawing or paying off massive debts to get their autonomy back.
So what does this all suggest about what genuine resilience actually is?
The book suggests that genuine resilience comes from independence from Washington's financial institutions and from decoupling your core services, food, energy, pensions, from the volatility of the global market.
That's right. The most significant protection from future shocks isn't military strength or more financial integration. It's building strong, local, democratically accountable public institutions.
Institutions that can't be instantly sold off when the next crisis hits. So the question this raises for you, the listener, is this. If democratic accountability plummets during a shock, how can societies protect their most vital public institutions, their schools, their healthcare, their infrastructure, before the next disaster comes?
Whether it's a climate event or a financial crash, the preparation has to happen in times of peace.
This systemic analysis was based on the groundbreaking work of Naomi Klein and her book, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism.
We strongly encourage you to read the book yourself, support the author, or check it out from your local library.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy systems-level analysis like this, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.